When the term Islamic architecture is mentioned, people often imagine fantastically domed, preferably with minarets and lots of arches, and sumptuously decorated and colorful buildings. Reductive and exotic, these popular images are evocative of the Arabian Nights for an earlier generation, mine that is, and Disney's Aladdin for this generation, my sons that is. But the impression one gets from the specialized literature, erudite and wide-reaching as it is not much different. In fact, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, built in 692, and the Taj Mahal in Agra, India, completed in 1654, usually frame any survey of Islamic architecture as the first and last monuments of a civilization that had its best days behind it. So pervasive was this restrictive historical construct that the term Islamic architecture had a very difficult time making the transition into the modern world of design. And even today, with many architects around the world using the vocabulary of Islamic architecture in their contemporary designs, mostly in response to passionate requests from their clients, the notion of a living and breathing Islamic architecture sits somehow uneasily within both the discipline of architecture and the scholarly field of architectural history. The scene was markedly different at the turn of the 19th century, when the term Islamic architecture first appeared in pioneering Orientalist tracts on architecture. The initial attempts at formalizing a name and a definition of that architecture were rather open-ended. This was probably a function of the novelty of the architecture encountered by the first European architects and draftsmen who came to the Orient with no prior knowledge of the architecture of that place. They measured and recorded buildings and ruins and illustrated them using all sorts of techniques, from freehand sketches to exact camera lucida projections and later photography. They then produced impressive architectural catalogues which began to reveal the rich architectural heritage of the Orient that was hitherto totally unknown. But having no model to classify, understand, and situate that architecture, they had to explore many possible historical and formal parallels with the histories of other architectural traditions already known to them, which were perforce classical or European. Thus appeared a series of tentative theories about strong formal and conceptual kinship between early Islamic and late antique, Byzantine, Romanesque, or Gothic architecture, which postulated direct exchanges between the two sides. The first text to scientifically examine what will be later termed Islamic architecture was the Description de l'Égypte, the monumental compendium produced by the savant attached to the Napoleonic expedition to Egypt between 1798 and 1801. A catalogue raisonné of prodigious proportions that formed the basis of the modern understanding of Egypt, the Description de l'Égypte was a paradigmatic enlightenment project, both in its exhaustive coverage and scientific accuracy, as well as in its conjectures, biases, and goals. The 2 volumes of plates on modern Egypt in the Description, published in 1809 and 1817, contain a selection of measured plans, perspective drawings, and analytical details of important Islamic monuments in Egypt that offer the first typologically codified analysis of this architectural tradition to Europe. The immediate successor to the Description de l'Égypte's precise method of recording architecture in all of its details was the French architect Pascal Xavier Coste, who published an impressive compendium l'architecture arabe ou monument du Caire mesuré et dessiné de 1818 à 1826, 1818 to 1826, which, as the title indicates, focuses exclusively on a selection of the monuments of Cairo. The book is conceived and presented in a grand tradition of the Beaux-Arts school, where Coast was trained. Every example is depicted in plan, sections, elevations, interior and exterior perspectives, in addition to short descriptive paragraphs to explain the drawings. A concise historical introduction sums up Coast's knowledge of the architecture of Islamic Egypt and argues that the Mamluk style of architecture, of which you are seeing a noted example in here, named after the dynasty that ruled Egypt and Syria between 1250 and 1517, is the distinguishing architectural style of the city of Cairo. But the detailed analytical drawings he produced seem to have been necessary for him as an architect to make the leap from admiring historical examples to adopting their distinctive elements for design purposes, which he was shortly to apply in what could be seen as the first historicizing Islamic architectural projects in modern times. The facades and sections in his sketchbook of the two unbuilt mosques he designed for Muhammad Ali Pasha, the semi-independent ruler of Egypt, one in Cairo and one in Alexandria, show that he adapted many Mamluk elements to a Beaux-Arts plan, such as the hypostyle plan of regularly arranged columns, ribbed or carved domes with high profiles that rest on a triangular corner, which are integral features of all Mamluk domes of the 15th century, and the ubiquitous stripped stone facades of alternating black and white or red and white stone known as ablaq in Arabic. The next wave of Orientalist architects expanded their field of investigation to cover all major regions of the Islamic world. They measured and recorded historical buildings and classified them into types and styles following a rather rigid dynastic periodization, which is still more or less with us today. Most of these scholars were originally trained as philologists, students of language, that is, in the Oriental institutes set up in major European cities in the wake of Europe's aggressive commercial and military expansion into the Islamic world. They brought with them, in addition to their serious historical learning, an excessive focus on the architectural object, detached from its living environment with its messy social, economic, and political considerations. And despite their erudite and prodigious scholarly output, these trailblazers, like their counterparts studying the architecture of other cultures around the world, accepted the canonic view of architecture as culturally stratified and linearly chronological. That conception was formalized when Islamic architecture became a subject of academic study towards the end of the 19th century. With this development, Islamic architecture joined a constellation of culture-specific, non-Western traditions which acquired the patina of scholarly authority and professional respectability around the same time. But lacking their own theoretical constructs, they found themselves subsumed by the conceptual framework of Western architectural history. This was methodologically expedient, as Western architectural history offered a ready-made classification system that could be adapted to the various non-Western cultures. It was also academically advantageous, as Western architectural history had a dignified scholarly tradition behind it and had substantially matured through its encounters with various anthropological and historiographical new schools of thoughts. But academic architectural history also engendered an authoritative chronology according to which Western architecture, from its presumed classical origin to its victorious culmination in modern time, constituted the historical core of world architecture and relegated other architectural traditions to peripheral places in its ordered hierarchy. This is best exemplified by the famous Tree of Architecture of Bannister Fletcher, which appeared as frontispiece in all the edition of his influential book, A History of Architecture on the Comparative Method for the Student, Craftsman, and Amateur between 1896 and 1961. We are in edition 26 now, and for the last 7 or 8 editions, this is no longer the frontispiece. This unabashedly racist diagram, which was internalized by generations of architects, reserved the trunk and the upper healthy branches of the tree to an uninterrupted succession of Western styles from Greece to modern America, and relegated the architecture of all other cultures, both in the old and in the new world, to dead-end branches. So you can see here, you have here Assyrian, and I can't read this here from where I'm standing. You have Indian here, and then we move up, and another set of dead branches that come after Greece and Rome is the Byzantine on the one side and the Saracenic, which is the older term that they used for Islamic. And then you move up in here, and you have nationally defined styles of architecture in Europe, moving in stages all the way up to the present, where the Empire State occupies the center. This hierarchical conception of the history of architecture, which owed much to the triumphalist colonial atmosphere of the late 19th century, had a real impact on the production of architecture in the Islamic world. Architects active in the major Islamic cities towards the turn of the 20th century, at the height of the colonial age, devised numerous historicist styles that borrowed freely from the varied repertoires of the past and blended them with various imported and highly regarded Western structural, constructional, functional, and stylistic modes. The examples are many. The earliest, in fact, go back to the first half of the 19th century, when the ruling elite of both Istanbul and Cairo, but also Marrakesh, Tunis, Tehran, Bukhara, Delhi, Ahmedabad, and other regional centers, was trying simultaneously to articulate an indigenous style and to push for some westernizing measures in the architecture it sponsored. In Istanbul, the capital of the waning Ottoman Empire, one of the most eclectic examples is the Dolmabahce Mosque, built next to the Dolmabahce Palace in 1853 for the reformist Sultan Abdulmejid by the most famous of the Armenian Beylian family of architects, Karabet. In it, the decision to adapt a neoclassical style to the requirements of a royal mosque can be seen as a political as well as an architectural statement. Much more creative and only recently recognized is the Italian Raimondo Daronco, who served as imperial architect to Sultan Abdul Hamid II in Istanbul between 1896 and 1908. Daronco first undertook projects for the imperial palace and several ministers in the historicist style with echoes of Ottoman Baroque. But his originality blossomed when he adopted the avant-garde Art Nouveau design vocabulary in the early 1900s. His most distinctive project during that period is the tiny Sheikh Zafir mausoleum in Beşiktaş in Istanbul, built between 1903 and 1904, a unique interpretation of urban Ottoman forms clearly influenced by the Viennese secessionist movement and the Italian stile floreale. In Egypt, several projects designed by expatriate European architects and executed under the patronage of Khedive Ismail, who ruled between 1867 and 1879, and who claimed that the country, and this is quotation, belonged to Europe, not to the Orient, revealed the same historicist eclectic tendencies as in Istanbul. This is how we should understand the work of the German architect Karl von Diebitsch in Cairo, such as the mausoleum he designed for Suleiman Pasha al-Faransawi, aka Colonel Sev, who actually served as the Minister of Defense for Egypt, where Diebitsch or von Diebitsch experimented with intricate Andalusian patterns in cast iron, the favorite new material of the moderns, such as Eiffel and Paxton in the Eiffel Tower in Paris and the Crystal Palace in London, respectively. Through a similar historicist approach, but with very different results, the revivalist design of the Austro-Hungarian architect and restorer Max Herz in the Al-Rifai Mosque, and the Mosque of Al-Rifai is this one. This is a 14th century Mosque of Sultan Hassan, which you saw sections of, and the two of them are competing with each other, and with the third mosque from which this picture is taken on the citadel of Cairo, looking down towards the city. So the mosque reflects the tremendous influence of the Mamluk Mosque of Sultan Hassan next to it, but still strives to produce logical and symmetrically arranged plan and facades in the manners of the Beaux-Arts school. Analogous impulses inspired the work of several European architects of the next generation who followed their predecessors in seeking work in the Islamic world, with a major difference. Now, most of the Islamic countries, except for Turkey and Iran, were under direct colonial rule, which usurped their political and economic independence, though it heightened and focused their sense of identity. As in the preceding phase, the most representative architects of this stage practiced in Turkey and in Egypt, which underwent major social, political, and economic changes in the early decades of the 20th century. Most notable among those architects in Turkey was the Italian Giulio Mongeri, who worked and taught in Istanbul between 1900 and 1930. He became interested in Islamic architecture and used its compositional principles and formal elements in various buildings, such as this Ulus branch of the Ottoman Bank at Ankara, finished in 1926. Several European architects distinguished themselves in Egypt as well during the first decades of the 20th century, such as the Slovenian Antoine Lasiak, who reproduced the various themes of an open and colorful Mediterranean palatial architecture in his Art Nouveau flavored buildings, such as this Bank Misr in Cairo, 1928. Another mixing of styles, but with the dominance of a neo-Arabic style, appears in the design of the new city of Heliopolis by the French architect Ernest Jaspard, as the new garden city built between 1908 and 1910 by the Belgian industrialist Baron Empin in this suburb of Cairo, built for the expatriate community. This generation also included architects from the Islamic world who studied in European schools of architecture and applied the lessons they learned in the public buildings they designed in their countries. Their work, though formally indebted to the Art Nouveau, eclectic revivalist, and other stylistic innovations of the period, is usually interpreted as a conscious effort towards the creation of a historically recognizable and legitimizing national image. To that end, they tried to identify within the vast Islamic formal repertoire the most representative subset pertinent to their new nation. In the Turkey emerging from the detritus of the vast Ottoman Empire in the first decades of the 20th century, a national renaissance in architecture headed by the architects Kemaluddin Bey and Vedat Bey, extracted details from Seljuk and classical Ottoman architecture, deemed more authentically Turkish in place of the pan-Islamic features used in the revivalist works of the previous period. This style, which became later known as the first national style, was defined by the use of the wide eaves, domes, pointed arches, overhangs, tiles, and muqarnas capitals in public buildings, such as this building by Kemaluddin Bey, Ankara Palace in Ankara from 1927. The situation was somewhat similar in the Arabic countries, which tumbled in the early 20th century from the domination of the multinational, though Turkish-heavy Ottoman Empire to the direct European colonial rule that encouraged a nationally and geographically circumscribed identity. Like their Turkish counterparts, Arab architects used an Art Nouveau base to recapture from the general Islamic repertoire elements that could be reinterpreted in a local idiom. This is the case, for instance, of Joseph Aftimos from Lebanon, who practiced in Egypt, Palestine, and Lebanon, and built several elegant major buildings in revivalist eclectic style, such as his Municipality of Beirut building in 1934. Mustafa Fahmi from Egypt adopted a strict neo-Mamluk style that was firmly identified with the country's heritage in most of his public buildings, such as this Ministry of Waqf, built in 3 stages between 1898 and 1929. Likewise, Abdel-Razzaq Malas from Syria built several revivalist eclectic public buildings in Damascus, the most important of which is the Fiji, or the water service headquarter building between 1937 and 1942, using mostly what he defined as Arabic motifs. The mid-20th century brought the end of the colonial rule, but the Eurocentric stratification of world architecture continued to exert a considerable influence on the national architecture of the sometimes hastily formed states of the decolonized Islamic world. In their zeal to purge their emerging national identity from any compromised influence, be it colonizer or pre-national, the nationalist architects bought into the cultural autonomy paradigm so as to reconstruct a pure and authentic architectural heritage from an exclusive and ultimately narrowly defined perspective. Of particular relevance in this vein is the work of the Egyptian architect Hassan Fathi, 1900 to 1989, the prophet of vernacular architecture. Fathi challenged mainstream modernist architecture by advocating a return to the vernacular as a source of architectural and even social rejuvenation. The design principles he proposed are seen as expressions of indigenously developed architecture with clear cultural and environmental contours and place-rootedness. But the ideological references in Fathi's vernacular architecture did not remain fixed over time. They expanded and even shifted with the changing national identity of Egypt as it went through the long and tortuous road from colonial domination to independence to development and its aftermath, entangled with grand dreams of regional supremacy, which we are actually witnessing today again. Fathi's discovery of the vernacular had its historical roots in the struggle against the British colonial rule in the 1920s and 1930s and the rise of an Egyptian national identity. He presented the first experiments in the village of New Gurna as the embodiment of an authentic Egyptian architecture, albeit of an unlikely mix of Mamluk and Nubian styles that he admired. But what started as a visual marker of an Egyptian national identity was transformed at least twice during Fathi's lifetime. After his return to Egypt in 1962, Fathi himself modified the interpretation of his architecture in his writing from a manifestation of a primeval Egyptian model to an essentially Arabic and later an Islamic one with ambiguous universal applicability. He first identified a ubiquitous Arab house with a spatially ingenious response to the harsh desert environment as the model for his own architecture. A few years later, the model became the Arabo-Islamic house, and ultimately an all-encompassing Islamic concept of domestic space with references to notions of the serene and protected family life. This process paralleled the ideological changes in the country from the pre- and post-independence Egyptianism to the Nasserite pan-Arabism of the 1960s to the populist Islamism of the 1980s, which has become the dominant cultural association of our time, underwritten by various regimes primarily for political ends. This badly understood process, which evolved intermittently in the vast majority of the Islamic countries, gave rise to an ideology that saw Islam as identity. The shift has been promoted by at least two economically and politically dissimilar, though ultimately mutually reinforcing social groups. First was the re-emergence of a fundamentalist political movement in many Islamic countries after an apparent dormancy of some 30 years. Spurred by the triumph of Khomeini's Iranian Revolution in 1979 and vaguely conceived as a response to the perceived failures of the national states to face up to foreign interference, economic corruption, and moral decadence, the fundamentalist movement sought a return to a more authentic political and social foundations to govern the Muslim nation. But despite its relentless and violent attacks on what it sees as the depravity of all Western cultural constructs, especially those aimed at the Islamic world, the fundamentalist movement showed surprisingly little interest in the conceptual contours of the study of various aspects of Islamic culture, including Islamic architecture. The second group that marked the 1980s was the elite of many recently formed nation-states of the Arabian Gulf region, which experienced an unprecedented prosperity with its concomitant socio-economic empowerment in the aftermath of the oil boom of the 1970s. Their new wealth, deeply religious and conservative outlook, and their fervent quest for cultural identity combined to create a demand for a contemporary yet identifiable Islamic architecture. Sincerely at times, but opportunistically at others, many architects responded by engaging in the design of various historicist styles, all modern, but all dubbed Islamic. The examples range from the late romantic mélange of Hassan Fathi and his imitators to the free and often arbitrary appropriation of historical forms. This is seen, in instance, in the high-quality sculptural work of the Egyptian Abdul Wahid al-Wakil, especially in the series of mosques he built in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia in the late 1980s, in which he used direct references to Mamluk Cairene religious architecture as the most appropriate historical context for contemporary Islamic religious architecture. A bit more colorful is the work of the Iraqi Basil al-Bayati, who is probably the most postmodern among the architects of his generation, as can be seen from his castle-like Scotland Great Mosque in Edinburgh. This trend culminates with grand projects by international firms that reinterpret traditional or evocative visual symbols and historical motifs and use them in otherwise ultra-sleek designs, such as the gigantic engineering tour de force Hajj terminal in Jeddah by SOM, designed by Fazlur Khan, who used to be actually one of the best engineers in the country, in 1982, and inspired by the Bedouin tent. Similarly, the Kuwait National Assembly complex by John Utzon from 1982 evokes the sale of the traditional dhow in a scheme not too different from Utzon's earlier iconic project in Sydney, Australia, which you see on top of the screen. More fantastically, another dhow-evoking project is the Burj Al Arab Hotel, designed by Tom Wright of W.S. Atkins in 1999, which extravagantly exploits all the cliché of the fabulous Orient in the service of the super wealthy jet setters. The cheapest room is $2,000 a night. More recently, and in a postmodern gesture, IMP claimed the model behind his Qatar Islamic Museum, built 2007-2008, to be the bold and simple domed fountain of the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, to your right on the screen, in Cairo, completed in 1298, whose sectional transitions of pure forms inspired the museum's rotating cubic design. Parallel to this historicist process, and following a similar socio-economic track, was the adoption of regionalism in contemporary Islamic architecture. Regionalism in architecture was initially advanced toward the middle of the 20th century as the indigenous response to the dominant modernist paradigm by an earlier generation, but has started to show signs of aging with the advent of the new forms, first of postmodernism in the 1980s, and then of globalism and neoliberalism in the 1990s and the 2000s, and their concomitant new urbanism. The simple notion of looking for regional references that originally appeared in nostalgic small projects all over the Islamic world, such as the early adobe and stone-domed houses of Hassan Fathi, excuse me, or the house of the poet Nail Shakir Khan in Akyala village in Turkey in 1971, was appropriated by large real estate and tourism developers and translated into mega projects. This phenomenon can be seen in countless locations, such as the Demir Holiday Village on Mandalaya Bay north of Bodrum on the western coast of Turkey, designed by Turgut Kansever and Company in 1987, and El Gurna tourist resort in Hurghada in Egypt, developed in the 1990s, to which the prophet of postmodernism in the US, Michael Graves, contributed a Sheraton hotel, which you see on the right-hand side. More extravagantly, new luxury housing complexes are springing up in the affluent cities of the Arabian Gulf, like Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Sharjah, and Doha, in which thoughtful regionalism is clearly given up in favor of compositions that loudly, and perhaps even too loudly, bespeaks the desire to endow a global pursuit of luxury in architecture aimed at the wealthy with sanitized but recognizable local flavors. But despite its enormous relevance to understanding the status of architecture in the contemporary Islamic world, and elsewhere for that matter, my focus here is, however, less socio-economic and more art historically critical. My main argument, in fact, is that the three phases of historicist Islamic architecture in the modern Islamic world, what I would call the Orientalist colonial, the nationalist, and what I would suggest to call the neo-Islamist, share the same discourse on Islamic architecture. They only differ in the historical segment they select as their main reference and the trajectory they derive from it. The Orientalists project the dawn of Islam as the beginning of Islamic architecture and the beginning of the colonial age as its end, so 7th to 18th century, and consider all preceding and contemporary architectural traditions external to it. They construct a continuous narrative that runs parallel to the Western architectural tradition, but almost never intersects with it until it dissolves in it with the onset of modernity, losing all creativity in the process. Both nationalists and neo-Islamists accept the paradigm of cultural autonomy developed in the 19th century, but emphasize different historical trajectories. The nationalists stress the point in time when their putative nation, be it Turkish, Iranian, Arab, whatever, rose to prominence under Islam or broke away from its hegemonic grip and construct their history selectively from that moment to the present, which they invariably see as resurgent. They sometimes search for some anchoring roots in the distant pre-Islamic past, as you see in these two examples, and postulate some latent continuity between that past and the awakening of their nation to its true identity in the modern age, forgetting that there are 2,000 years in between. The neo-Islamicists, too, have their slice of history, which is a medley of golden ages stretching from the high caliphate in the 8th century to the gunpowder empire's high tide in the 16th century. They try to rebuild that romantically remembered architectural utopia using purely postmodern compositional and formal techniques and leaving out all that they consider inauthentic. The end result is that both nationalists and neo-Islamists conceive their architecture from an exclusionary perspective inherited from their Orientalist predecessors and sometimes teachers. Progressive architects working in the Islamic world, however, began in the last 40 years to breach the artificial boundaries of their domain and to look for inspiration in a hybrid architectural heritage with substantial connections to all cultures, past and present. They shun dogmatic and unique cultural references and adopt instead multiple sources in a creative process all their own. The building they design reflect this process in the composite provenance of their forms, spaces, and techniques. They refer to the modern, heterogeneous cultures, technologies, ideals, and images that encompass the lived experience of their designers and users, as well as to the cultural, religious, and social heritage. My examples will perforce be limited and selective, but they are nonetheless representative of this rationalist trend in dealing with the heritage in the contemporary architecture of the Islamic world. My first example is the work of the master Iraqi architect Rifat al-Shadirji, who in his various projects of the 1970s, such as the Rafidain Bank and the London Mosque and this Federation of Industries in Baghdad, subjected the iconic markers of Islamic architecture, i.e. the arch and the dome, to modernist and cubist compositions. The Egyptian Kamal el-Kafrawi achieves something similar with the ubiquitous Gulfi wind catchers he deploys as visual rhythm in his University of Qatar complex, finished in 1985. Perhaps more explicitly, the Egyptian Abdel Halim Ibrahim, tries to deconstruct the elements of Islamic Cairene architecture in his Al-Hawd al-Marsoud Park in Cairo in 1989, and to rearrange them as imaginary castles in stone for the children. His intelligent use of the Mamluk mausoleum of Salar and Sangar, this building in here, as a backdrop to his project highlights his intention. A number of architects turned their attention to adapting the visual vocabulary of modern architecture to the requirements of mosque architecture, perhaps the most formally conservative of all Islamic types, to stunning results. In Sharifuddin White Mosque in Visoko, Bosnia, finished in 1980, Zlatko Ulgin skillfully assimilated modern influences, especially Le Corbusier's Ronchamp Chapelle of Notre-Dame du Haut, that you see on the left-hand side here at the bottom, and traditional Ottoman forms and elements. His mosque is firmly anchored in the present, but its indebtedness to its past is clear in its overall form and reference. For example, this is actually a very beautiful tubular arrangement, which even though may or may not have been meant as such, but it could be read as the word Allah in Arabic, even though it is just basically tubes in some sort of an abstract arrangement. In the National Assembly Mosque in Ankara, Turkey, built between 1987 and 1989, the Shinichi group designed a modernist place of worship for a secular government, but managed nonetheless to display innovative abstractions of all the traditional elements of mosque architecture. Notably, the plexiglass mihrab adds an unusual symbolic touch by alluding to the notion of the mihrab, which is the direction of prayer. This is the mihrab inside the mosque, and it's usually a niche in the wall. In this case, they made it out of plexiglass. So you see how the light filters inside in the direction of the worshipper. And this alludes to the notion of the mihrab as the gate to the luminous hereafter, which is actually a Sufi esoteric belief. Starting from the other end of the traditional modern continuum in the Great Mosque of Riyadh, built in 1992, the Palestinian-Jordanian Rasim Badran recreated and transformed the spatial character of the local Najdi architecture, the region in Saudi Arabia where Riyadh is located, without directly copying it. His rationalizing approach resulted in recognizably historical form that still managed to assert their contemporaneity in their sleek finish and their proportional and perspectively driven arrangement. The cumulative effect of these and other explorations is bound to set contemporary Islamic architecture well on its way to finally devise its own historical and formal contours as a contributive and living component of world architecture. But perhaps their most profound outcome is to make the case for a critical reappraisal of the dominant paradigm of the entire discipline of architecture, which legitimizes a theoretically reflective and historically evolving Western architecture, while casting the architecture of other cultures in outdated categories, unable to beget modern living expressions. Reaching this goal, however, depends to a large extent on two interrelated conditions. The first is how can the architects practicing in the Islamic world today resolve the tensions inherent in the discourse of Islamic architecture and diffused over such binary oppositions as regional versus global, transcendental versus historical, traditional versus modern, or vernacular versus designed. The second and more painfully critical factor revolves around how will Western architects and architectural historians, in their capacity as prime arbiters of the discipline, receive and incorporate the thoughts and work of their newly assertive interlocutors, so that future architects can have dreams that encompass more than a single window with a tunnel vision on the history of world architecture. Thank you.